My name's Chris Cook. I've been at Microsoft for a couple years, and my role there is to essentially take all of the unauthenticated data that we collect across our publicly facing websites and try to figure out ways to connect that into both our authenticated data and all of our campaign ecosystems.
And I'm Luke Boris, co-founder and principal architect for Campfire Analytics. I'm sure some of you have met a few of the members of our team at our booth, but if not, feel free to swing on by. Otherwise, Campfire Analytics is a digital analytics consulting firm where our focus is in helping our clients and their teams achieve their analytics goals. For me personally, I have a stronger focus on the infrastructure side. So about a year ago, that's how I was able to team up with Chris for this project.
Let's take a little look back at the past, pre-2016, before I came on board. Within Microsoft Office, we had about, if you look at public-facing websites that you can get to without actually having to authenticate in some way, there were about 25 different ones run within the corporate office of Microsoft. Of that 25, about half of them allowed third-party tagging of some type or another. But it was all completely decentralized, and it was just set up where there was a single team that owned the TMS instance that was actually a vendor team, and they operated under a first-in, first-out process. So anyone, anywhere in the world, asks for tags on any one of these websites, they get the tag, no questions asked, no thought to what it's going to be used for, no thought to any kind of bigger strategy. So it essentially went like this. You've got some agency partners that are working with probably thousands of different teams. So you've got teams at the corporate headquarters that are running campaigns. You have teams in each individual subsidiary that are running campaigns. You have product teams that are running campaigns. You have event marketers that are running small campaigns. It was just all of them had their individual agency partner. The agency partner would come up with whatever type of campaign that they were running, what tagging they needed. They handed that off to this quote-unquote tagging team. The tagging team took that, placed it in Insighten, published, go from there. What this ended up doing was just that we had literally thousands of tag deployments. And that was across around half of the sites that Office ran. The other half of the sites are all owned by engineering teams that looked at those other sites and said, no way in hell are we taking on any of this stuff. So you not only had a situation where we had out of control, no governance tagging in place, but you also had half of the entire ecosystem that wasn't allowed to be used for any type of campaign and wasn't really measured in the same way as other sites. So some process limitations here. Let's see. So obviously, no cross-market communication. So you'd have situations where there's a team at the corporate headquarters that's running a campaign across 16 different markets. One of those markets happens to be Germany. Well, in Germany, there's a separate team there that's running a campaign looking to do the same exact thing as the corporate campaign. But since neither of them really had any knowledge of the other, they just operated in silos. There was no kind of global strategic alignment, so you might have alignment from a branding perspective or something like that, but there was no plan of like one campaign to be running to one set of conversion points, another to be running to another set of conversion points, maybe like an organic campaign of some type running, maybe an engineering team launching a new product. All of that was completely separate. Third point is that there were misaligned optimization points. So what I mean there is that you'd have a situation where maybe someone in corporate office knew very well about how a purchase flow worked. So they knew that you could tag the exact point that we actually got money from a customer, where someone in a subsidiary office in Greece knew that a purchase happens at some point in time, but they had no direct connection to any of the engineering partners. And so the agency would say, well, We don't know exactly how that works, so we're just going to run our campaign to click on a buy button instead. And so at the end of the day, though, both campaigns through different channels would report on the number of sales. And so one is reporting on a buy button click, the other is reporting on actual revenue coming in. It led to all sorts of confusion all over the place. You'd have situations where maybe France is reporting 1,000 sales of this, the corporate office is reporting 1,000 sales of this, there were only 1,500 sales total, like what's going on here? And then the last point, all sorts of misspent advertising budget because it was happening all in different silos everywhere. There was really no way to tell what advertising was working and what wasn't because there was no way to deduplicate one against the other.
So this definitely led into a lot of inefficiencies on the deployment end as well. That for the first point, inconsistent approach to the solutions being deployed. As you could imagine, if there's inconsistency around the world as to where tags should be deployed, what conversion event, how that's actually defined, all of these requirements are bundled together and then handed off to the deployment team. They then tag the site using whatever JavaScript framework they're comfortable with. And over time, as vendor teams have come and gone, the number of approaches have exploded. There were also a number of deployment platform limitations. A lot of this has to do with nobody really setting up any sort of governance requirements for the teams that are making these deployments. And again, that comes from a lack of organization all the way from the tag requesters. And ultimately, this isn't a scalable solution approaching tagging this way. So this would lead to very high maintenance costs and variable costs. By that I mean if you want to bring a new site into the fold, you would have to multiply the total number of people supporting tagging for that site. So 3 sites means 3 times the number of people supporting. So as you could imagine, eventually this solution would end up costing more than the benefit.
So after 3 or 4 months on the job and just kind of pulling my hair out each day thinking like, what in the world can I do here? I came up with an idea of what our standardized framework would look like. And this is basically kind of separated out into 4 separate points here with keys in between each point in some kind of privacy compliant way that would go into Microsoft owned data. So we didn't have concerns from our privacy and legal folks. And emphasis would be placed completely on like a global tag setup for each individual partner. So instead of having agencies use their own specific Facebook account, for example, and creating a pixel and handing it off to us to implement, we would own a Facebook account, we'd own a centralized Facebook pixel, and we'd share out details to the agencies. I bring up that one because when we were actually removing all of the tags, we found that across the 10 or so office sites that were being used, we found 200 different Facebook accounts being used. And that's, I mean, we had individual markets that had more than 10. So it was a gigantic mess. So you can kind of see here, if you start from the left, the ads and offsite activity, we've centralized down to 4 places that we're collecting data. There are actually a couple others that aren't listed there, but basically we've had it set up so that we're going to collect in a few different places. We pull data in from those places. We have keys created so that in Azure and other places, we can tie all this together for analytics purposes, and then we can also push it back out into the execution platforms themselves. So part of the reason for doing it in this way to begin with was to bring some of those engineering teams on board that weren't okay with the tag management system. It's allowed us to take the proprietary web analytics that we have in place there. We could collect information off of those sites, combine it in with everything that we're able to surface through a TMS, but then actually have like a holistic picture across the whole company. Now, as we've moved forward with this, the number of those sites that don't allow TMS has slowly fallen because we've started to gain some trust from those teams. So eventually we may do more of this fully online rather than the mix of offline and online, but that's kind of the thinking there behind having to mix everything in our own systems. So you can also see that we've got the on-site web analytics, which is scaled down to just a very small number of pixels that are there now. Same with the conversion events, very small number. And that's really just to account for what we can capture through a DMP pixel plus the walled gardens. Through a variety of different methods, we kind of sync those audiences across the different services so that ideally when we're targeting an audience in Facebook, it roughly mirrors what we would target through Adobe or somewhere else. And then that last thing on the right is the really big one for us. We wanted to be able to tie all of this together to all of our Microsoft-owned data that is orders of magnitude larger than this data in the first three columns. And that's everything from product telemetry to lead lifecycle data, actual sales and subscription data. So all of that is tied together a relatively simple way, relatively simple setup that we can then take out and evangelize to all of these engineering teams and eventually other business groups as well to show that this is a much easier way to collect everything, and then here are the benefits that you get from that. So then we had to think about how to create this system. So the idea of creating those different connection points is I won't say easy, but it was relatively straightforward as to what needed to be done. But first step was the organizational requirements that were needed. So I mentioned before that we had situations where we were literally using 200 different Facebook accounts. Now, that was partially because there was no real governance around it, but it was partially because in many cases, you've got these small teams that have relatively small budgets, and they're responsible for a small market or even a small set of activities within a market, and they really don't care about everything else going on. And that was a problem, but it wasn't a problem to any specific person. So we had to put together the idea that we would have centralized governance, but it would still be easy enough for all of these individual teams to execute. So part of that was rolling out something that was scalable. The consolidated KPIs is the next bit, that we had to come up with a small set of KPIs that any campaign or any team looking to measure was measuring in the same way across all markets, and specific to whatever that measure was. So I brought up the example before of a buy button versus an actual sale. This was basically saying that we're going to, across our different execution platforms, we're going to have one way that we measure a consumer buy, one way that we measure a commercial buy, one way that we measure a trial sign up, and that's where every single tag fires off of that single event. We pass some different metadata for that event to tell them apart from one another, but nothing outside of that is allowed to be tagged in any way. The big problem here is the global agency alignment. So I'm sure those of you who work for a big company, there's probably some agency of record, but that quickly fragments because you may have a global agency of record, but then each individual subsidiary is working with a different team. They may not communicate quickly and easily across the different teams. And then you'll have situations where there's a small market that they're running a $5,000 campaign. They don't want to deal with the agency of record. They go hire some vendor to do it themselves. As long as we were supporting any tag coming through, that was something that just proliferated. So we had to really work to say that in order to run a campaign, you had to either use the agency of record that had all of the details of this, or you had to use our exact framework. A key part of that framework are the partner master accounts. So this means that if we're running a display campaign through MediaMath, for example, we have a central MediaMath account. Everyone who is going to run a campaign through MediaMath has to join that account and run their campaign out of that specific account. That way we didn't have a situation where they'd come back to us saying that, hey, we need this other pixel because the data from Pixel 1 is only flowing to this account. That's owned by Microsoft. We need one owned by Wonderman in Brazil for this one. So that was, this slide looks relatively simple, but this was by far the hardest part of setting things up because you had to really kind of retrain thousands of employees across the whole globe over how we were going to actually do this. And then we get to the actual fun stuff.
So on the infrastructure side, the question of how do we actually put this into practice, what infrastructure do we need to have in place in order to get us from the previous model to the standard framework, the ideal state. So it made sense for us to take an inventory of what was already available. Rather than rebuilding the entire system from the ground up, if there were any parts that we could repurpose for our current needs, it would make sense to use those. But we first needed to define what it was exactly that we needed. And this is where the concept of the universal tag came from. A big help for that was the global accounts, where you can have essentially one pixel representing all being deployed across the entire globe, but essentially just for Microsoft. But what do we actually need this pixel to do in order to make that happen? So our requirements here were this pixel, any pixel that we would call a universal pixel, needs to be deployable to any page without issue. Second, it needs to accept metadata from the page. So in order for us to pass unique information about a page, basically making a given touch point along the conversion path or anywhere, making that uniquely identifiable if we're using the same exact pixel across all pages, we needed to be able to pass data from our data layer on a given page into this pixel. This data needed to be shareable with partners. And again, that's where this global master account is helpful. And ultimately, less of a requirement, but more of an outcome, this pixel is durable. It's sustainable over the long term. So what we already had to work with were a lot of relationships with these pixel owners, these vendor teams. So we started reaching out to them to see what was actually possible on the universal pixel front, whether or not their pixel could accept metadata. And it helped us whittle down a bit who we could actually work with beyond the whittling that Chris already did. Yep. So second, as mentioned in the universal tags requirements, where the tag needs to be able to accept page metadata, we needed metadata on the page. This would be found in our data layers, but an issue that we were working with is if we're working across 25 to 30 different sites, all using different content management systems, the usual way to reveal data on a page is via the content management system, but that wasn't going to work for us, at least not in a timely enough manner. It would have taken years for us to work with each individual CMS owner to get the data that we need from their system onto the page. So we fortunately, in the past, Chris had built another system that did essentially what we needed. It was already being used for web analytics, where it was a gigantic table where for each newly created page, we would define the values of about 10 or so, 10 to 15 dimensions, a standardized set of values across all 25 to 30 sites. So that way we had this standard way to measure, as well as a standardized data layer across all of these sites and content management systems that we could draw from. So this UPL is currently about 70,000 records deep. So we have a lot of data to work with, and it covers a lot of Microsoft properties. But the requirements here are, it also needs to be available on all pages. There needs to be unique page identifiers. So the example earlier where if we're deploying the same tag to every single page, how are we able to differentiate one page from another? It needs to have content classifications so that we can add additional valuable data when and where needed. And it needs to be easily maintained. So fortunately, this system, this universal page lookup, that 70,000 records deep table, or set of tables rather, has a UI that you could enter page metadata into, which made it a lot more helpful for adoption and general use. And last infrastructure requirement is a deployment medium that can make all of this happen. So, as Chris mentioned earlier, it was a Tower of Babel situation with all of the global vendors doing whatever they really wanted from a deployment perspective. They would request the tag be deployed on page X, and the deployment team would make that happen, whether or not it actually made sense to deploy it in the manner that the requesting team was requesting. So having a system that would allow for governance, having a system that had features that we could mix and match. Basically, we wanted to reduce the total number of deployments at the time was about 3,000 through the former tag management system, down to as few as possible. And the way you do that is make as much of it modular, componentize as much of it as possible, so that you can take parts that repeat and reuse them where it makes sense. We couldn't really do that, at least the way that the former TMS was being used. And something that can be automated. We want this to be quick, efficient, and ultimately remove as much human error as possible. As soon as you open the system up to people, there's bound to be error. So we wanted to avoid that. And that's through all those requirements, through what we've dealt with and experienced before, is what led us to, spoiler alert, pick Telium to do this. And the way that this tagging infrastructure, once we decided everything that we needed, once we decided on Telium, what the tagging infrastructure actually looks like, the process itself, you have metadata creation, the metadata path at the top, and the universal tag deployment at the bottom. So from the top, a new page is created. We define these 10 to 15 dimensions about the page, and then load that information on a per URL basis into this 70,000 records deep universal page lookup.
And a lot of that's done automated. We have connections to many of the CMSs, but yeah, it's all, there is a manual way as well. So.
Yeah, good point. There's not about 50 of us typing these out day in and out. So we needed a method to make this data on a per page basis available on the pages themselves. And that's where Telium's data layer enrichment feature set comes in, both on the UI side, and they have a helpful API that allows you to upload files to their CDN. So on a per record basis, we would convert them into a file structure that could be used by this DLE, this data layer enrichment feature set. We would upload the files to Telium CDN, and based on the rules that we set up in the UI, these files, this data, would then appear on the respective page that it's needed. So a very helpful set of features. And it fulfilled that requirement that we had for metadata that could be used across a lot of different content management systems. So the next track is universal tags and the system that we've put together to support it. Actually, if Mike's still here, some of the features that you're rolling out with today, or that you mentioned today, we had to build in-house a bit, so we're really looking forward to those coming out. But we would define a structure for each individual tag and define the metadata that needed to be passed into the respective tag. We would build or put each tag into its own file. And since we were going to be deploying a standard set of tags across all sites, we found it a lot easier to manage our code in this way by dividing everything up. And then ultimately, we have a build automation system where we can bundle everything back together. And that gives us a nice little minified code package that we can then upload to Telium. And what this does, when you compare what we're doing now to what we were going through before, it's reduced. We've increased the number of sites that we're working with, but it's reduced the total number of required tags, required deployments to about 30 from 3,000. So it's been very helpful. It's been a lot more efficient. And once these files are in Telium and pointing to a domain, then the mapping can happen. The data layer values start getting mapped to where they're needed in a given tag.
So now some results. They were big. The first one was the agency AdOps. So this is a bit of an estimate, but if we look across all of the different subsidiaries and corporate agency used, the corporate team, for example, in Office was actually able to scale back the number of people that they were using for AdOps from the agency by two full heads per year. And then there was an equal reduction across all of the different subsidiaries. So we estimate about 8,000 annual hours. And this was mostly work where all they were doing was literally just creating a tag every time a new campaign was launching. And since we now have this in place, 99% of the time, there's nothing needed then for each campaign. Next one was analysis efficiency. Like what we ran into in the past a lot was that we'd have situations where we'd see a campaign within the US, for example, think that it was performing in one way, but it didn't really match up with what we were seeing in web analytics or what we were seeing in downstream systems. And so this required a lot of like going back to figure out like why is paid media saying they're driving X amount of results when it just doesn't, there's no way this can be happening. So having a setup where we do have everyone driving to a similar set of KPIs, we can correctly deduplicate across them, and we can actually start building multi-touch attribution and more advanced techniques like that has already led to about a 15% reduction in required time. That's mostly just because we're not diving down rabbit holes anymore. More, it's allowed us to actually start analyzing things that matter rather than trying to figure out what the hell did this campaign do in the first place. So site-side tags, so Luke mentioned it already. We decreased the number of deployments down by, well, almost 99%. But if you just look at the sheer number of tags that we're using, it's down by about 90%. And that's because we were able to understand that some of the things that were being done in the past really shouldn't be done at all. Like if we're going to have a DMP on the site, there should be one DMP, not 3 or 4 different DMPs. If we're going to have, if we're running Google remarketing for a site, we shouldn't have Google remarketing to 3 different accounts. Seems fairly obvious, but when there's no one looking at it, that's what happens. And then partner accounts. So I already mentioned Facebook before. We went down from 200 to a single account. There were several others where it was similar scale, went from 100 down to 1 or 50 down to 1. And then silo elimination. So this kind of gives you a sense of the amount of money we spend in Office for advertising. But we've been able to move around $10 million this last year into basically new tactics from what was there before. And that's, in almost all cases, that's just because we found out that 2 different teams were doing the exact same tactic at the exact same time and competing against one another. And then the other benefits, we now have a lot closer relationship with the agency that's used. And by closer relationship, I mean specifically my team. So we look at before, when we started rolling this out, the agencies were pushing back on me as just being yet another roadblock for them. Now they're completely bought into the process. Improved engineering relationships, so we're now out across basically every important Office website at Microsoft because we've been able to show these engineering teams that we actually can control what's going onto your sites. Built-in governance and non-centralized activities, so that's what I mentioned a few times before, where now if someone in Croatia wants to spin up a small campaign, they have a set of 10 KPIs they can drive to. We know what those are. We'll see the money, we'll see the traffic coming through our framework, but we don't have to work with them ahead of time to figure out exactly what they should be driving to. And then the last benefit is that now every org across Microsoft wants this. So we're starting to roll it out across some of the other business groups, and I think that in another year or so, we will have this globally scaled across the whole organization. So thanks, everyone.